a dangerous lack of historical or historical understanding. And so people, their passions belie the fact that they don't really have a deep understanding of what they're talking about or what they're committed to. And once you start studying it, then you realize that there are multiple perspectives on everything. For example, I'm reading right now a biography on Ella Baker. Ella Baker, who is at the center of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, and she's writing about leadership as whether leadership is group-centered or leader-centered. And her attack against Martin Luther King and a lot of the African American ministers is that they were black middle class, and they come out of Atlanta where they grew up in a way without struggle, with a sense of privilege. So without understanding the struggle, how can they actually make it? So she's the one who became the mentor for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee when it met at Shaw University and began that whole struggle. I didn't know about this at all. I grew up in Japan making Martin Luther King out to be a hero, asking my parents, why in the hell are we in Japan, in Hiroshima, when we could be back in Mississippi or Georgia or whatever, working in this movement? I mean, it just, as a 14-year-old, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me.
At least you got the excuse that you were in Japan.
Yes. Not at all. You didn't have that at all. So anyway, that's my perspective, is a lack of multiple perspectives and a lack of historical or developmental awareness.
And I'm really glad you brought up Ella Baker, because as I read, there's a sociologist, Francesco Folletta, who wrote an amazing book called Freedom is an Endless Meeting, which is so fucking true. To get anything done, it's like you gotta sit down and just write days and nights. But you know, quoting from Ella Baker and her work in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and so much of that participatory, consensus-based, deep democracy, you realize, wait, this sounds like a lot of the stuff that anarchists are talking about today. And I'm not sure if people who call themselves anarchists or embrace anarchism are aware of those connections. Maybe maybe those connections need to be made. But I think, you know, guess what? This was going on in the 50s. This was going on in the 60s in the South, in African American communities in the civil rights movement. People were talking about deep ways of imagining and producing democracy. You know, to speak directly to your question, the environmental justice movement, which, you know, I've been a part of for many years now, was really founded or just emerged precisely because of a problem that's similar to what you're talking about, in that the mainstream, largely middle-class white environmental movement was, and I would argue still is, deeply classist and racist and sexist and heterosexist and speciesist, but also that within many communities of color there really wasn't a very visible acknowledgement of this problem, of how communities of color in particular and working class communities are being assaulted by environmental threats. There have always been sporadic acknowledgments of that, but in terms of an organized movement to deal with that, no. So many folks in the environmental justice movement don't refer to themselves as environmentalists. I don't refer to myself as an environmentalist precisely because of that divide. Now I work with and for environmental organizations, but I do that largely to push them towards integrating human rights and a non-speciesist approach to social change. The final thing I'll say about that is that I think when you know, what you raise is really important, I think, for teaching and organizing. Because I always say, there's almost no one, you know, in this room or in any room that I'm teaching in who is not privileged or oppressed or disadvantaged in some way. And so I go around and say, how are we, you know, oh, I'm light-skinned, I speak standard English, you know, I'm middle class, etc. Okay, well, I'm also African American, you know, I'm from the South, you know, I've got this, that, and the other going on. We can talk about ways in which our experiences intersect and reflect both privilege and disadvantage. Then we can understand, oh, wow, okay, so maybe there isn't this sort of real figure, maybe it's mythical, of this population or this individual who is singularly privileged or singularly disadvantaged. So maybe we can get down and work together. So for me, you know, you raise a very good point about intersectionality and how we can teach and organize for social change and not demonize people and really build on folks' experiences and our desires for everyone to be free in some way, and how we uniquely approach that through our biographies.
I think the animal rights movement is very similar in terms of the extent to which it touches people from the entire political spectrum, and with that entire political spectrum comes knowledge and ignorance on all the various issues, you know. So you have actually some very right-wing people who are into animal rights because of the relationship they've had with their pets or something, you know.
I had a question or a comment.
I was gonna ask you how, the big difference between the school system in Japan and America, and since you said you formed school system there.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the most interesting phenomena is that after World War II, there was not only an occupation army in Japan of the United States and Australia, there was an education occupation. The first books that were published for the development, I don't use the word training, of teachers was the work of John Dewey, which is just absolutely amazing. Until you look very closely at Japanese education, I mean, Dewey's emphasis on learning by doing, his developmental framework, his organicism, his emphasis on craft, the emphasis on education is not simply preparation for life, but it's good living itself, had a tremendous impact. I'll just give you two quick examples that I think we could adopt in this country. It wouldn't cost us a thing. The first thing that's very important was the idea that a teacher is not a part-time worker, that it is a profession, and it is its life's calling. And in Japan, in order to be the principal of a school, you must have at least 30 years of teaching experience to become a senior teacher. And it's the senior teachers who are chosen to be the principal. So principal in Japan means principal teacher. You also find this true in Africa, in many countries, where the emphasis on the teacher, the distinction between teacher and principal or administrator is not made. It's based upon seniority and on competence. A second example is the idea of forming communities that exist over time. So in Japan, every teacher teaches first and second grade, third and fourth, fifth and sixth. So you have the same children for 2 years. So there is no break between the summer. There is work with the learner to get to know the family. So two very simple examples of how, in fact, if we would use Japan in some ways as a reflective mirror back in the United States, there are some things that we could learn that never were popular here, but were very popular in Japan.
We might have a really quick comment or question, and then we have to wrap up just to respect everyone's time. One more comment?
Could I just say that my book came out this is shameless, my book came out in September, and I was able to use it fall semester for both social problems and a course called Citizenship and Democracy. And it worked very well, so that's my shameless comment. Anybody that might be interested in it.
Is it possible for us to just hear from the people who are here what you're doing and just how you connect, just at least briefly? I'd like to hear what you're doing and what you're...
Say your name and what you do.
Yeah, a little bit.
My name is Moses Jame, I'm a senior, and I started working at Hamline to save the kids and get students about knowledge.
I'm Simone, I'm studying environmental and ecology and communications. I'm trying to combine those two together somewhere along the line of environmental justice. So,
my name is Edgar Oviedo and I'm a junior. I guess my first exposure to social justice is I used to volunteer for the Sierra Club North Star chapter. So I associate a lot with being a conservationalist and environmentalist. And I've also worked for the Minnesota Conservation Corps over the summers in their summer youth program. And then last year I was a service learning coordinator in Chicago. So I traveled lots of many different community organizations and whatnot.
I'm Stephanie Robinson, I'm a senior, and just started an internship with Save the Kids, and then I did an internship with LSS, Lutheran Social Services, dealing with long-term homelessness and transitional housing, working with kids, and also a part of the movement, which is basically policies that need to be addressed here for Hamline students, the people that can't afford. Like me personally, have a lot of friends that couldn't afford schooling here because tuition's too high and they have to leave. So basically the movement is trying to find ways for Hamline to address these resources out here for students so they won't have to leave school.